My name is Dave McIntyre, and welcome to Wine Line Live, a sort of 5 o'clock happy hour edition. I am pleased today to welcome Michael Kaiser, a dear old friend of mine and supporter of local wines back when we had an organization called Drink Local Wine that promoted the idea of wine from around here, wherever here happens to be. So thank you for joining us. Michael is here today in his capacity as the executive director of Wine America, which is a national trade association representing American wineries. Michael, welcome.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I guess I was thinking about this yesterday when you reminded me we were doing this, and the first Drink Local Wine event that I went to was in Colorado, and that was in 2012. Um, and that was the first. I mean, in my position, I've been lucky enough to have wine from almost every state. But that was the first. It was great to see people who of like-minded people in terms of local food was a thing. Why wasn't local wine a thing? So I think that's something that through my work with Wine America led me. That became a passion of mine, just kind of a natural progression, I think.
Exactly. And I think that the situation of local food, but not local wine, has gotten a little bit better, but there's still a lot of work to do in a lot of places. Which is okay. We can keep the message going. But so, Michael, please tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to work for Wine America. You're not new with the organization; you've been there for quite some time.
Hmm.
And I'd like to know how you come to that position, and then we can talk about the organization itself.
Yeah, so I was born and raised, not to go too far back, but I was born in New Jersey, and I moved down to Washington D.C. like so many people did to go to graduate school. That was 1999. So I've been in DC longer than I was in New Jersey. So I'm a DC native, I would say now. And I live over or by what's going to be, I guess, the new RFK Stadium. It was the old RFK Stadium with my wife and two sons, 17 and 14. So, um, but yeah, I graduated. I went to American University. I graduated with a master's there. Worked in some. I worked for a couple lobbying firms, kind of doing legislative tracking and research and bill tracking. And I that so in 2006, I had left a job there. I was actually working as a tour guide here in DC on the Segways. I remember those things, Segways. I don't know if they're still
Yes.
a thing, but I did that for a summer. And while I was doing that, I had an employment agency kind of searching for me to find a job, a more permanent thing. This was, obviously being a tour guide was not going to be, at least not for me, going to be a permanent thing. So what that led, the agency said, hey, there's this winery trade association that wants you to, or they need someone to handle regulatory affairs for them. So that was, and the way the alcohol industry is regulated, there's through the Treasury Department primarily, through the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, which is a segment, a bureau within the Treasury Department. And there's a bunch of rules and regulations that all alcohol producers have to follow. And they needed someone to kind of interface with them. So I said, well, I don't know anything about wine. And they're like, well, you don't really need to know anything about wine. You need to know how the government works, know how regulations are done, the legislative process, what have you. So I was like, sure, I'll do it. So that was July of 2006. Do the math. It's 20 years and 1 month with the organization. And again, I knew nothing about wine other than when I went a few years earlier, I'd gone through Europe, and that was really my first true wine experience, like consuming wine. And but I didn't know anything about American producers and or anything like that. So, and then over the course of the last 20 years, I've had to do various things with the organization. Primarily for the last 12 years, doing our legislative affairs and kind of the lobbying work, which I'm still doing at my current job. And then this May, I was made executive director, and then fully given the reins to be head of the trade association, um, I guess about a week and a half ago. So it was announced on Tuesday of last week, I think. So basically, the end of July, our outgoing president, Jim Tresice, who had been with the organization for a long time as well, also was head of the New York Wine and Grape Foundation, has stepped away from Wine America. Still very active in the industry. I'm excited to see what he's going to do next. But that kind of led us to where we are, where I am right now.
Okay.
And I get, the second thing, I guess, what is Wine America
Well,
is,
before you get into that, if
yeah,
I could just add a little bit of context, 'cause I used to work for a regulatory agency, and people who are not in Washington maybe don't live and breathe this stuff, but any industry has some sort of regulations that affect them local, state, and federal. But alcohol, because of our history with prohibition and everything, the regulations are particularly strange sometimes. So it's very important to have that representation here in Washington working on that issue. So just with that context, please tell us
yeah,
about
and
what Wine America is and what it does for wineries that it represents and the benefits that we consumers get from your work.
yeah. So I mean, that's a good point. I mean, alcohol is unique in the sense that we have 50, well, 51 if you count DC, 52 with DC, all 50 states, and then federal government sets of rules and regulations for alcohol. How each state determines how it's sold. So that's a lot different than a lot of other industries. So we have to contend with that. But from a federal standpoint, yeah, I mean, if you every wine label that you look at has to be approved by that agency, the TTB I mentioned earlier, before it can go to market. If there's federal excise taxes that alcohol producers need to pay. So, I mean, to answer your question, what does Wine America do? So, first of all, we're a nonprofit trade association, a 501c6, as they're called, which means because of the C6, we're allowed to do advocacy. And basically, if you're a winery in the United States, you have a federal basic permit, meaning you can make wine, you can belong to our organization. And the dues, go from $500 to more than that, way more than that, actually. And what that gets you primarily is it gets you representation here in DC from a government affairs standpoint, meaning that if there's an issue, and we'll talk about some of the issues in a little bit, but if there's an issue that would impact your business, whether adversely or whether it be a positive thing, we would be working on the winery's behalf to make sure that either it doesn't happen or it does happen. And it could be, a tax break. It could be, getting money for research for new grape varieties or pest management, pest mitigation. You're trying to stop the spotted lanternfly or something like that. So that's why a winery would belong to Wine America, and we represent wineries from all across the country. But really, our bread and butter are the wineries outside of California. And the reason for that is that the California wineries also have the Wine Institute, which is a California only trade association, and they also have a presence here in the DC area, in DC, and at every state, every state there, the Wine Institute works to help improve laws for wineries. So, but an interesting question is like, well, how does this impact the larger industry? How would it impact the wine consumer? Well, if say I just used a hypothetical of taxes going up. If taxes were to go up on alcohol or wine and specifically, that might mean that the producers would have to raise the prices, meaning that the consumer would have to for pay higher for their favorite wines. And if we are available to help prevent something like that, that's how the work we do would kind of get passed down to the consumer. And a good example also is, I mentioned grape research, and there's a winery is always trying to figure out if they can grow a new grape, or what they should be growing. And I think a lot of wineries who figure that out, they become well known with consumers, and so all this has kind of a trickle down effect, if you will. And we were just talking before we came on, but Wine America actually had a consumer membership for that they did way before. What this is what years ago, before my time, and for whatever reason it didn't work. But I think that as a value added agricultural product, the work that we do is important, and it benefits not just the producers but the people that consume that product.
Yeah. Well, that of course is important to all of us. I want to take the opportunity to welcome everybody who has joined us and remind everyone that you're watching Dave McIntyre's Wine Line live with Michael Kaiser, the executive director of Wine America, the national trade association representing U.S. wineries. And I'm glad you mentioned the Wine Institute. I think maybe that name might be more familiar to a lot of people. And of course, if they're representing wineries in California, a lot of that may be to the interest of, or to the benefit of wineries elsewhere, but those interests aren't going to be exactly the same. And the wineries elsewhere are going to have other concerns, I'm sure, that you represent.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and we're at the point now where the industry grew so much in the last 20 years that also almost every single state has their own trade association as well for wineries. Like, for instance, there's the Washington Wine Institute. There is the Oregon Wine Growers Association, Texas Wine and Grape Growers Association, and they all, they're doing work in Olympia and Austin and state capitals. So, but the Wine Institute is unique in the sense that they do work in Sacramento, but also here in DC and across the country. And yes, there is going to be a lot of overlap with issues there that are important to the entire industry. But it's so unique that each state has their own industry now, that there's going to be different things that are important to each state. And like just an example, the wineries here in our region, in Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the Mid Atlantic region, they had that devastating frost in April that killed so many. It's going to hinder so many wineries this year with their vintage, the 26 vintage. And one of the things that Wine America is doing currently is we're trying to get some disaster funding. So there's not really much of a issue with frost for grapes in California.
Yeah, even though you do see the frost fans, and at least the flatter areas. So, what if you are able to get that disaster relief aid? And I was just attending some events in Maryland where the Maryland Wineries Association and the State Department of Agriculture were honoring 6 of their pioneering wineries from the 70s and 80s that sort of laid the foundation for the growth that the state industry has had. And they're estimating that um, that freeze on April 21st will cost Maryland wineries about $14 million just in lost retail sales this year.
Mhm.
And of course, the ramifications will be felt for years beyond that. And we heard initially really dire assessments of, concern that there was a lot of vine kill, and I think now people are realizing maybe not so much, but that the effect, certainly on the 2026 vintage, is overwhelming. Um, and they also were talking about all the state regulations that had to be changed to allow Maryland wineries to pour samples to visitors, sell a glass of wine, have tables and chairs for people to sit at when they visit a winery tasting room. Those were not allowed in the beginning. So you have that. You mentioned the network of regulations that the wineries have to deal with. Those were pretty formidable. And I think it's probably because the regulations weren't set up. Nobody was thinking of a Maryland wineries when they were devising these regulations years and years ago. So the wineries had to come in and say, "We're doing something new. We need to have this changed." And Wine America is that voice, I guess, on at least the national stage, right?
That's right. Yeah, and Maryland's a good example of you know a state that has grown, but also a state that has had to deal with a lot of those antiquated rules. And they've been lucky. They're lucky where their current the executive director of the Winers Association is now the Secretary of Agriculture there, so he understands the industry.
Yeah.
And I think he was the first person that represented value added agriculture that was appointed to that position. So I mean, he's got a unique perspective on that. Um, but I mean, that's just shows you the overall value of trade associations too, which is not even at the state level and at the federal level. And a lot of people will say, well, why should I join my state trade association or the federal association? It was like, well, can you afford a federal lobbyist? Are you going to be able to afford a federal lobbyist for $500 a year? No, you're not. So, and who else is going to, there's nobody else that's going to do it there. I mean, but the problem that trade associations will forever face is that the work that we do benefits the entire industry, not just the people that belong to the trade association. So, and that's just a sacrifice that we all make, those of us who work for trade associations, knowing that, we believe what we're doing, we believe in the industry that we're working for, but not everybody's going to believe in us in the sense that they're not going to, pony up the money to belong. And I get it. I mean, if you're a winery, right, particularly right now, you got they're trying to find ways to maybe cut costs, save some money, and the first thing to go is something like a membership to an association. And you got if you're in certain places, I know you were having a Finger Lakes Riesling there. In the Finger Lakes, there's you might belong to your local the wine trail, and then there's the Finger Lakes Association, and then there's the New York Association, and then there's us. So some people actually have to budget and pick and choose what they think is best for their business at that particular time. And we'll see people who say, "Look, I can't join this year, but I'm going to be back next year," and that's happened. So, it's just a fact of life and that's why I believe if you work for a trade association, you better believe in the commodity that you're working for. Otherwise, it's just going to be, you're not going to just enjoy your work. And I've been lucky, to be able to meet people, all kinds of people from all different, sides of the industry in this job, whether it's someone like you as a writer and hobbyist, or the people that own the wineries. It's really by association. I think the industry is really wonderful.
Well, how many members does Wine America have currently? I know it's
Well, that
probably, like you said, it's
fluctuates.
in flux every year.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's around 400. It's not what it needs to be, and but at the same time, one of the things that has been good for us is that we have a association membership as well. So again, we talked about Maryland. The Maryland Wineries Association is also a member of Wine America. And, they there's a little confusion. That doesn't mean that their members who are not member of ours are also members, but the association membership is what truly gives us that national reach. We talked about the Wine Institute. They're members of Wine America too. And, that is really our grassroots network too. Once we're trying to work on an issue and get something, passed or done, we will tell the state associations, and that way we can literally mobilize hundreds, if not thousands, of wineries.
It's like an old-fashioned phone tree.
It is, yeah, it is
Get
like that, yeah.
get the word out. Okay, so what are some of the well, maybe let's look back a little bit on some of the accomplishments of Wine America over the past several years. Um, and what you've worked on and what the effect of those have been, the changes that you have been able to get through Congress or the TTB. What are some of those?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing that we got done in my 20 years with the organization was something that's known as the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act. It's a mouthful, but um, and what that was is that was a comprehensive bill that um, created a bunch of tax breaks and for the alcohol industry for
When was
producers of
that?
all sizes. That was in 2020 that was finalized and made permanent. So what happened with that? We started working on that in 2015, and we were able. And at the end of 2017, we were able to get, as so often happens in DC, we were able to get a 2-year version of the bill. So it was going to be good for 2 years. And what it did, there was what was known as the small producer tax credit before that, and that was a carve out for small producers to pay a lower excise tax on wine. And we in the wine industry, we're lucky enough to have to pay a tax just for the fact that we produce something. I mean, that's how what an excise tax is. You produce it, so you got to pay a tax because you're producing it, basically. Um,
But
and
and small producers are, I imagine, the vast majority of the
oh yeah,
wineries we represent, because anything that's out of California, New York, Oregon, and Washington probably is going to be pretty much a small producer.
yeah, the vast majority of the 10,000 or so wineries like you could say 9,000, and if not 9,500 are small producers. There is, I mean, there's obviously a couple of big ones, but the vast majority of small producers, and basically it's the difference between paying $1.07 a gallon versus 7 cents on your wine produced. So what this bill did is it got rid of the small producer credit and expanded the credits for everybody. And it wasn't just wine; it was also beer and spirits included in that. And we all pay different levels of excise taxes based on alcohol content. So spirits pay the highest, beer pays the lowest. Um, so that was in 2000, in it was 2017, and then 2 years later in 19, we got a 1 year extension, taking us to 2020. And obviously, we all know what happened in 2020, with COVID and tasting rooms got shut down. A lot of wineries pivoted to direct to consumer, whether it be shipping or in certain cases, like here in Maryland and Virginia, they were doing local delivery of wine. That was a special exemption, and so the wineries needed this tax break to continue. So at the end of 2020, we were able to get it in one of those very large omnibus bills that gets done every at the end of every year, and it made it permanent. Now the wrinkle is that, and this is over the Christmas break, like Christmas, between Christmas and New Year's, and we expected the president to sign it, and he said that he was not going to sign the bill and there was a threat of a government shutdown. So there was a stretch of about 3 days where we thought that this was not going to go through, and in the end, he actually did sign it. And
Was that, did he sign it before or after the attack on the Capitol? No, that's never mind.
it was before that. It was before that. Um, but there was, but there's the volatility of that administration, and the current administration has been tough on the business. But I would
That,
say
but
that,
that's also that. I mean, to be fair, that is something that happens in Washington. It's part of this big omnibus
yes,
bill, and something can happen that puts an objection up for the something in the bill that's large politics, and all the smaller politics that's wrapped up in there suffers, or can
and just
suffer, or can be blocked for something that has nothing to do with the merits of the
right,
argument of itself. And that's life in Washington.
and to illustrate that even further, we had something like 80 senators co-sponsoring this bill, and over close. It was over 300 members of the House that were on this bill, bipartisan. And you would think with all of that, it would have been able to have been passed on its own and signed into law on its own originally. But the nothing issues like this always get folded, as you said, into larger things that have nothing to do with them. There's no reason why a tax bill should be included in a year end massive Christmas tree bill, and that they don't call it that just because it comes out of Christmas. They call it that because all this stuff is
All the
attached to it.
gifts underneath, right?
Yeah. So, but I would say, I mean, that was probably the most important and significant thing that I personally worked on for the association and organization. And it came at the right time in 2020, 21, getting that permanent so people wouldn't have to worry about their taxes increasing. I mean, the smallest of the small people wouldn't see an increase, but the mid-sized producers would have seen like thousands of dollars in uh, tax increase, and that would have been detrimental right at that point. I mean, some of the other issues, we're always working on agriculture issues and trying to get money for research and pest, pest management. The spotted lanternfly is a big problem here on the East Coast, and now that's spread to California. So that's a problem for them now. Um, and the newest, one of the newer things that we've had to work on is kind of pushing back on this almost. I mean, the best way to put it is kind of neo-prohibitionist narrative that's out there right now. And how how are we to respond to this direct threat to our industry? And in the sense that obviously, you know we cannot and would not suggest people drink alcohol for a health benefit, but at the same time, people have been consuming alcohol for thousands of years, moderate consumption, which is the vast majority of consumers. And now all of a sudden it's become, and maybe this is analogous to what, yeah, to what it was like back then, but that's for different reasons. I mean, back then it was, if you watch like one of my favorite documentaries was the Ken Burns documentary on Prohibition, that came out a few years ago, and they go into the whole societal impacts and reasoning for Prohibition. But in this case, I mean, and a great way to kind of illustrate how that crept into federal issues was, so every year, or every 5 years, I should say, there's what's known as the dietary guidelines for Americans. And what this is that, and there was a big deal, RFK Jr. had a big role out of this with his new food pyramid. But basically, it's the government's recommending what you should and should not eat, and how much of you should, like we've all seen the food pyramid, and now it's upside down, which is kind of fitting. But so every 5 years that has to get done, and it's done through the Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services. It's a joint process. And alcohol had been in there for a long time. Recommendations about, if you do drink, this is what you can safely consume. And for many, many years, they recommended, if you're a man, you can safely consume 2 drinks per day. And if you're a woman, you can safely consume 1 drink per day. And what they considered a drink was a 12-ounce beer of around 5% alcohol, a 5-ounce glass of wine at like 12, 13%, and a 1.5 ounces of spirits, whether it be, on its own or in a mixed drink. And for many, many, many years, that's what was considered safe consumption. Make no mistake, the guidelines were not pro alcohol. They weren't recommendations. They weren't recommending people drink 2 drinks per day. They were saying, if you do consume, this is what you should consume. That also didn't mean you should consume 14 drinks in one setting. It
Call it
was,
your week, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. So, but they and it said, if you it also they also said, if certain people should not drink. There's health risks, obviously. So that was how they were for many, many years, and including the last one that was from 2005 or 2020 to 2025. So the process this time around, the way it works is that the Congress authorizes and appropriates money for these guidelines, and what they do is they authorize agencies within the government to do certain studies. And what was authorized through Congress was a study that, through NASEM is the acronym, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And they gathered experts to study the health outcomes of consumption of alcohol. And so that's was what Congress authorized. But the Biden administration also had HHS do a separate study for the first time, not authorized by Congress, through the Interagency Coordinated Committee for the Prevention of Underage Drinking, which is ICPUD, which is a mouthful. And obviously, we all want to prevent underage drinking. But that was completely unrelated to, health and health outcomes. And they were also picked to do a study for the guidelines. And there were two different, very different groups. There was the people that were contracted to do the ICPUD study were critical of alcohol consumption. And they looked at, like, NASEM looked at actual health outcomes, where ICPUD, they looked at societal outcomes as well. So whether it be drunk driving or domestic violence or anything bad that would come out of overconsumption of alcohol, and not just the basic health outcomes. So what my organization did and other organizations did is that we were like, well, hey, this process is not how it's supposed to be. Congress approved the NASEM study. They didn't approve the ICPUD study. So this is out of the ordinary, and we do not want to see the ICPUD study be used to formulate the guidelines. And in the end, that's what happened. The It was the USDA and HHS decided to only use the NASEM study, and lo and behold, they had two very different outcomes in this study. Both were critical of alcohol consumption, and both said, there's an increased chance of risk of certain cancers if you consume alcohol. But the NASEM study said that there's lower all-cause mortality. And what that means is that they looked at people who consume moderately, and they tend to live longer. And I think a lot of that is, lifestyle choices, whether it be the food that they ate, the fact that they're active people. And what the ICPUT study, and I'm obviously paraphrasing here, said is that if you consume any kind of alcohol, you're in 10% or 100% chance of risking death, basically.
Right.
It was pretty bad. And both said if you don't drink, you shouldn't start. There's certain people if you're but what did change, which is something we did not advocate for at all, was the fact they got rid of the two drink, one drink thing and in the guidelines. Now it just says consume responsibly. So, you know, it was kind of a blessing and a curse for us to be in there because you wanted to be in there to say this is what you safely can consume, but if we were removed, it looks bad for the industry. So
Yeah. And this again seems like just the epitome of a Washington story, because this is an important issue that you and the other organizations lobbying on behalf of consumers and producers focused on process. This isn't the way it's almost like you weren't necessarily arguing the merits of moderate consumption, but you were focusing your opposition to you're going out of process. And that's a very
right.
Washington way to do it. And it seems like you were effective. But for me, this whole issue, you mentioned drunk driving and underage drinking. I mean, we litigated all this over years and years ago, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And it's the argument is consume responsibly, know your limits, don't drink and drive, don't operate a forklift, as we read on the back label all the time. Don't drink when you're pregnant. That sort of message. Don't get drunk at the office Christmas party and make a fool of yourself in front of your boss. And obviously, don't take advantage of other people when if you lose control. I mean, that is a message of responsible consumption, and that is changing now with what I call the new prohibition. That isn't catching on. Everybody's saying neo-prohibitionist, but that's okay. That this argument that there's no safe level of consumption, that this sip of Riesling from Keuka Spring Vineyard in the Finger Lakes is going to give me cancer or increase my um, chance of getting cancer. And if you look at the numbers, it's not that dramatic. The Surgeon General advisory that came out at the end of the Biden administration said, and I'm quoting from memory now, so I may be getting this a little bit off, but basically, if you have two drinks a day, I think it was, um, uh, an American male would have about a 13% chance of getting cancer. Well, if I didn't drink anything, my chance was 10%. So
Right.
the increase isn't as dramatic as the no safe level message that now is permeating media coverage. Just today, the Washington Post had a column by their brain health columnist promoting this argument too. And my thought was brain health columnist. Wow, that sounds like an interesting gig. But so this is something that the message is changing. The political message is changing, and that's what worries me as a student of politics as well as a wine lover, that it's going away from know your limits and consume responsibly, which was the two drinks a day for men, one for women, to don't drink at all.
Yeah, and that also, it's there's a couple things that I want to that you touched on that I want to comment on, like with the whatever the what I call neo-prohibition, anti-alcohol, whatever you want to call it. they tend to lump all alcohol consumption into one big monolith, if you will, meaning that you're having that glass of wine, and that it's the same as someone who has five vodka tonics in one sitting, or it's the same. You have one beer at a baseball game, and it's the same as someone who's drinking a 6 pack or a 12 pack every night. If you go to a baseball game once a week, and it's obviously the vast majority of people that consume alcohol do it responsibly and do it moderately. And that's what we encourage for obvious reasons, not just because of health, but because of societal outcomes, like you were talking about. Um, and also, the other thing is that there's a lot of, you mentioned the advocacy that we do and things like that. The There's also, they lump all alcohol producers together. So they're equating, if you're a tiny winery in Maryland or Pennsylvania, they're saying you're the same as Molson Coors. that that you're the big big alcohol big alcohol killed the dietary guidelines, basically, is a narrative or something like that. And actually, you're right. It was not about the outcome. It was about the process. The outcome was going to be the outcome. We would have dealt with the outcome no matter what it was, but the process was the problem. And I mean, that's just a microcosm of kind of what we face now, and this changing narrative. And at the same time, there is, you're seeing people consume less and less alcohol. I mean, one of the other issues that we're kind of working on currently is that there's been these prevalence of these THC hemp-based beverages that, and I won't get into the nuance of this, but that were technically made legal through the last Farm Bill 8 years ago, which legalized the cultivation of hemp. And there's a loophole that if you extract THC and then reinfuse it back into these products, you can create intoxicating products that are basically, um, they're not technically not cannabis, but they do have THC in them. And you're seeing these things sold at places like Total Wine, at like at gas stations in certain stores. There or places you can get them sent through the mail to your house, and it's basically legal cannabis, federal legal cannabis, which was not the intention of that. And that's just something that is gained in popularity. They don't have the same regulations that we do. So right now we're working on kind of curbing that. And we're to use the prohibitionist word, we're not prohibitionists in the sense that we think these products should be able to exist, but there's really no regulations for these things. And they it there's and we've created strange bedfellows. So now alcohol has kind of partnered with the traditional cannabis groups and companies who also don't like this, because you're like, hey, you're being sold on Total Wine, but we're sold in 30 something states in a dispensary. And how does that make sense? So, that's just an example of the outside threats that the wine industry in particular is facing. Also, for a long time, it was like, well, ready to drink cocktails, that are killing the wine industry. There's always something that is kind of going to kill the wine industry. But and the industry does need to adapt a little bit better than they have, quite frankly, in certain aspects. But there is, but to have, I was being glib. There are legitimate concerns and threats out there.
Yeah. In our conversation before we went live, you mentioned that we're now in the third consecutive presidential administration with a president who does not consume alcohol, and that is unprecedented. At least certainly in your time, but I guess probably for all time. Uh, so, ha- have you seen an effect in that way? I mean, I mean, obviously Trump has a winery, or his son does. So, but he is imposing tariffs and doing other things and tariffs we haven't mentioned yet, that are hurting, impacting the wine industry. So,
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. Like they both, then we're talking about Trump, basically, and both administrations did things that were both friendly and adverse to the industry. That I would say. using the Biden administration, they did the Biden he put out an executive order about competition in the marketplace. And there was a whole section about alcohol distribution in there, and they instructed the federal government to see what could we do to alleviate some of the issues that alcohol producers were having with distribution at the state level. So that's an
Did
example of something that was
did
um,
anything come of that?
there was a study. So and since it was Biden related, Trump canceled everything related to it. So, but also I mentioned the tax bill. I mean, Trump signed that into law. The whole thing was done in his
Right.
first term. So I mean, there was that, um, and so those are two positive things that both of those administrations did. Negative would be, that the Biden administration had that ICFOD study that I was telling you about, and then obviously tariffs have been bad for our for wineries who are export. I mean, biggest issue is that none of our products are on Canadian store shelves right now. And that's directly related to tariffs, but also related to some of the things that Trump has said about, that the Canada being the 51st state, what have you. So, and also so if you're like a winery in Indiana, they're asking me, well, why should I care about tariffs? I don't export. Well, you care about your ability to get tanks and barrels. You care about the ability to have a distributor. And if that distributor is having problems because they can't sell certain wines that they can't import, they're not going to be able to sell your wines either. And the other argument I hear is for tariffs from the administration and others is that, oh, well, they'll just switch to American wine. Well, probably not, because in a lot of cases, American wine is more expensive. And say, this is the example I always use is say you're an Italian restaurant in Philadelphia. I'm just picking any city. And you specialize in, you know, small producers from a certain region in Italy to go with your cuisine. You're not going to all of a sudden switch to Pennsylvania wine for that list, or even California wine. I mean, they're going to continue to want to get the wines from Italy, which means they're going to have to put, the cost is going to go back onto the consumer. But it also means that doesn't mean you're going to have a new market for your wine if these foreign wines are not going to be here. Conversely, also, if you're looking at like a Safeway or a Harris Teeter or a Wegmans stocking wine, and they're going to stock what sells at a grocery store in particular. So they may look to a similar wine from, say, California or South Africa or South America to replace that European wine. They're not going to all of a sudden go with a Virginia wine to replace that. So, but there's also, I mean, the biggest thing that I tell wineries is that you want to get your wine on store shelves as well. But there's got to be a shelf for you to put it on. And if they're out of business because they, the cost of importing wine or selling those wines goes up too much, they're not going to be able to sell your wines either.
Yeah. Okay. So we're still feeling the impact of tariffs. So I imagine that's still a high on your agenda for Wine America in the coming year. What other issues will you be working on behalf of the wineries and
Well,
consumers?
I mean, you're looking ahead to I mean, we're going to have a new Congress next year, which always kind of, you would think that provides opportunity, if you will. We don't know what it's going to look like. Obviously, if the Democrats retake the House and the Senate, or just one of those two, there's going to be a lot of investigations into the last 2 years. We can imagine that's going to happen. So the concern is that, and this is a concern if things stay the way they are, is will there be actual governing happening, or will it be kind of what we're seeing now? Um, but looking at, like, tariffs are still going to be a big issue, and if the Democrats do take over, maybe there'll be some investigations into how the tariffs were implemented. Um, Again, I mentioned the things that come about up every year are funding issues primarily. And one thing we're concerned about going forward is disaster relief funding, because whether it's a freeze here in the Mid Atlantic or in New York, whether it's fires in Washington and Oregon, California, and now Idaho as well. Their industry impacted by smoke exposure to the grapes. We're always constantly looking, we always have to constantly get disaster funding relief. when that happens. And one thing that we might be looking at in the new year is like, let's establish that so we have it every year. So if there's, wine grapes are what are known as a specialty crop, versus a row crop, and the specialty crop is things like strawberries and apples and grapes, as opposed to like cotton and wheat and corn, soybeans. Those are row crops, and they tend to get most of the farm subsidies.
Those are what's
But
the other word you're using? Real crop or row?
specialty crop, row crop.
Row, ROW.
Yeah. So that's like when you see those giant corn, um,
Yeah.
crops. So they tend to get most of the farm subsidies and agriculture subsidies. And what we hope to do is, if we can get a dedicated disaster relief fund to specialty crops, which wine grapes are considered, we won't have to put our hand out every year when there's a disaster. I mean, I think that's important for us to look at. There's always pest management and mitigation, um, but I think we're just going to have to see if more anti-alcohol stuff comes along in Congress, and what they're very the other side is very organized, if you will. And I hate to use the term the other side because I don't think they're I don't know if there is sides in this, but it we're gonna just have to see what happens in that regard. But I think the biggest concern right now that at least I personally have is that will there be really even any governing next year? And if we what that's going to like with the volatility of this administration, just in the sense of being unpredictable, and how that's going to work with the different Congress, um, and you know what that could mean for the industry, because that's going to have an impact on everybody.
And there is a bipartisan wine caucus.
Yes, that's right.
In is it in both houses of Congress or is it just in the House? It's
It's primarily the House, but the Senate, they can belong to it. The what it but so Mike Thompson from California is the chair of that, and he it represents Napa and some of Sonoma County. So he started this. He also is a grape grower, and currently Dan Newhouse from Washington State is the Republican co-chair, and he's retiring, but and he represents kind of the Columbia Valley, basically, is his district in Washington. So, but yeah, it's very bipartisan. We're lucky in the sense that wine is nonpartisan in a lot of respects. We're liked by both sides of the aisle. We've, as I mentioned, the craft beverage bill, we had all those, with 70 something senators on almost 80, I think, at the end, and a huge amount from the House, over 300. So, you know, that is one advantage that, obviously you got to kind of, when you work for a trade association representing the commodity, you kind of have to check your personal politics at the door, which is, I've gotten pretty good at it. At least I think I have. And, because we have to work with everybody, and we do work with everybody. And I think the fact that the wine caucus is one of the larger caucuses in the Congress is an example of just how the industry has grown, but also at the bipartisan aspect of what we do and who we represent.
and they have good parties.
Yeah, we haven't had a big reception in a while. I think you come to it when we did do it, but we're talking about maybe doing it again next year, where we did this thing called the Wines of America, and we would get about wine from 25 states, and do a reception for members of Congress and staff and certain invited guests like yourself, to and we you know it's a good way for congressional staff and members to taste wine that they probably wouldn't have never tasted before. You know, last time we did it, we had wine from Vermont, and we've had wine from places like Alabama and Louisiana and Arkansas, and it's stuff that you would just not think that you would be able to consume or taste.
Yeah, I think
And
I had a South Dakota wine or something at one
yeah,
few years back, and that was my first chance at that, so it's pretty cool.
yeah, it's a lot of work, and but we're talking about maybe bringing it back, so we'll see.
Alright. Well, we've almost filled the hour. Funny how fast the time goes. Is there anything else that, you'd like to mention, either looking forward or summing up what we've covered? We have a few people who've joined us within the last few minutes. Thank you again for joining Wine Line Live with Michael Kaiser of Wine America.
I would just say I think if I'll give a professional and a personal opinion or view. I think it's important for wineries and the wine industry to have a trade association that represents them in DC, and like every commodity. And you never we've kind of started talking about it as like an insurance policy, that we're your insurance if anything were to go wrong. On the personal side of things, I would say if you try something you've never had before, or if you're in a new city and you're traveling, go to a local winery and see what it's like. Or try if there's local wine on the restaurant list, and if you're traveling for work or pleasure, try that local wine. And just be open to exploring all these. There's a just in the U.S. there's a huge wine world out there, and I think wine, we like to romanticize it, but it's true. I mean, you might taste an IPA from any state that might taste exactly the same as another IPA, but a Chardonnay from Virginia is going to taste different than a Chardonnay from Oregon. And that I think that is I want to see more consumers be more willing to, and it's gotten a lot better. I mean, since I mentioned drink local wine in Denver in 2012, it's gotten a lot better since then. And I think that group that you and I were a part of felt like we've done about as much as we can, and I think where we put these industries that we've spotlighted in a good spot. And that has gotten better in those years, but we're still not there.
Right. So more to come in future years and future discussions. So, final question then. What is Michael Kaiser drinking when nobody's watching? When no politics, nothing
Right.
involving work or anything, and you're just relaxing. What are you reaching for?
Well, I gotta say, I'm kind of a sucker for what's known as a macro beer, if you will, or like a Budweiser or something like that. I love going to a baseball game and getting a Budweiser. Is something that's I find romantic about that, but also I think it's there's a time and place for something like that. And I'm not just I not people sometimes you think about I mean obviously I drink wine, and obviously I'm drinking a lot of I tried a lot of different wine. But, the guilty pleasure, if you will, is probably a cheap beer.
Okay, that's fair enough. And a lot of winemakers will tell you that you can't make good wine
Yeah,
without a
exactly.
beer. So, all
Having
right.
said that, I do love craft beer too.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, when I go to the ball game, I'm looking for the district
Oh,
brewery
yeah,
or
we wanna
the
support the local producers, but
local producers, yeah.
I think a Nats game is the only place where you're excited to pay $5 for a 12-ounce can of Budweiser. Like,
Or $18 for the big
yeah.
cup of whatever. Um, all right. Well, Michael, thank you again for taking time out. And thanks everyone for listening. A lot of people joined us really quickly and stayed on. I'm pleased to see that. Again, this will be posted on my Substack, Dave McIntyre's Wine Line, after I clean up the transcript a little bit. So you can come back and read it, and people who weren't able to join us can read it or watch the video then when it's posted. So, Michael, thank you. Congratulations on your new position and your new leadership of Wine America. I think from this conversation today, we all know that the organization is in good hands, and
Well,
we look
thank you.
forward to maybe inviting you back to check in on developments from time to time.
And I wanna point out I have a shirt on that says "Drink Virginia Wine." So I
All
did that.
right.
So you got to again support your local producers, and support every American winery.
Yeah. Well, we've gotten plugs in then for Virginia, Maryland, and New York, as well as South Dakota and a few others that we've mentioned in Vermont and Texas. So that's great. So thanks everyone for joining us. And thank you for the thumbs up and the likes and everything. And stay tuned for more on Dave McIntyre's Wine Line and hopefully some more live sessions too, because these are fun. All right. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks.